I'm Vinnie Politan. The subject of my investigation is the suitcase murder trial. George Torres died an excruciating death trapped inside a suitcase. But the woman responsible has a story to tell. The question is, will anyone believe it? Here's more. Sarah Boone and George Torres were involved in a toxic relationship. They both met at a bar after prior marriages broke up. Their relationship was filled with accusations of cheating and abuse, but for whatever reason, they always seemed to end up back together. On February 23rd, 2020, Sarah and George were together at her home, spending some time painting, doing puzzles, and drinking. Then things turned to a bizarre game of hide and seek. George got inside of a suitcase. Sarah zipped it shut. Sarah says they were laughing, but then things turned dark. George began to panic and begged Sarah to let him out of the suitcase. She refused. She began to record him while she taunted him. Then she went to sleep. George died in the suitcase. Sarah was charged with murder, but claimed she was in fear for her life. It's a story with a tragic ending, but lots of lingering questions. So, in trying to figure out how and why all of this happened, right, there's some really significant issues, because there's a man begging for his life in a suitcase and a woman standing outside. They're in a relationship. She apparently loves him, but there's some problems in their relationship. There's a toxicity between them. There's violence between them at times, but they always get back together. So, to me, an important part of her story is to tell the world, tell the jury, why she didn't just let him out of the suitcase. Take a listen to Sarah Boone's testimony here, talking about that very issue.
Why didn't you let him out before you walked upstairs? Were you afraid?
Terrified is more of the word.
As long as he was in the suitcase, he couldn't harm you.
Correct.
When he's... Did you want him to calm down?
Yes, I wanted him to stop being angry because I know what it is for him to be angry.
Sarah Boone, you said that when he was in the suitcase, he was threatening her, threatening you. Can you tell the jury what he was saying?
I don't know, am I allowed to curse?
Yes.
But he was going to in me, and that's what made me ask him please to stop doing what he's doing to me, that he was going to, I'm guessing, try his best that night to probably take my life.
But what, the threat you heard was he's
going to
say
end me.
Excuse me?
End me.
End you?
Yes.
There's the threat that night that she said George Torres made while locked in the suitcase, unable to open the suitcase himself, needing her to open the suitcase for him so he could get out. But that's what she's saying at that moment. That's why she's not opening it. Brings me to my first question of our investigation, which is, was Sarah in fear for her life? In self-defense, this is what you need. You need to be in fear that something bad is going to happen to you. That's why you've got to act or react the way you are. And her reaction here is not getting him out of the suitcase. So was Sarah in fear for her life? Let me bring in our experts who are going to help us tonight. Both are joining us from Florida. Jury consultant, human behavior expert Susan Constantine is with us, and also joining us, forensic psychiatrist and a diplomate in addiction medicine, Dr. Daniel Bober is with us as well. Great to see everyone. Thank you for being here. Susan, let me start with you. What are you seeing? What are you hearing from her as she answers that very important question about why she's not opening the suitcase, testifying about this fear?
Well, when you listen to her talk about the fear, there's a pause. She's asked about was she in fear for her life, and then she pauses and she says, I was terrified. So it was that pause there that gives me some pause of why she had to change that language. So my question begs is, was she in fear for her life, or was she just in fear? Because I do believe she was in fear, but I don't believe at that point that it escalated to the point where she was in fear for her life.
Dr. Bober, what are you hearing there from Sarah Boone?
Listen, Vinny, it's very hard to put ourselves in her head that night. But the bottom line is there are other things she could have done. She could have called the police and said, hey, we were playing a game. He's in the suitcase, but I'm afraid if I let him out, he's going to hurt me. Can you please come over and assist me? She could have called a friend. He said he was unable to breathe. I just think there were other things that she could have done. So we'll never really know how imminent that fear was. But, you know, this is unfortunately something I see all the time in my office. People in these very toxic relationships, 1 in 3 women are suffering intimate partner violence, and 1 out of every 4 men. So this relationship is just emblematic of something that goes on across the country. And this also brings up the whole issue of the battered woman defense, which is based on the original research of learned helplessness. And it's been highly variable across jurisdictions in the U.S. And in fact, some people say that because it doesn't really have empirical support, and it's not in what we call the DSM, that a better framework for this is PTSD as an explanation for this type of behavior. But to me, it seems like there were alternative paths that she could have taken.
Now, you talk about the intimate partner violence. There was violence in this relationship, and she described it, and we're going to play that testimony, but you're also going to see some images at the end that are evidence of that violence, which could be a little disturbing. Let's take a look.
He started to pull on me and kept saying that, excuse me, that I just want you on the steak and you on the potatoes. And I took offense to that, and I kept trying to encourage him to eat. I started to eat.
Was this just him really drunk and saying nonsense?
I don't know why he was so angry that day. I don't know if it's because I got steak. I don't know. Most of the time, I don't know the reason why. I couldn't take it anymore. Obviously, I was not going to be able to eat, so I started to crawl off of the bed to leave, just the bedroom. And he told me again that I'm not going anywhere, and he stabbed me in my leg, and it crunched. You could hear a noise that it made, and blood just started to come out of my leg, just like a fountain. So I got off of the bed. He's starting to freak out, and grabbed me a towel. I got a wet towel, and I'm sitting here holding the towel, and it's increasingly becoming even more and more saturated by the minute. It's just minutes. So I'm going through towels, and I said, George, I think I need to go to the hospital. This is not stopping to bleed. This is serious. And he got on his knees and begged me, please don't call the police. Please don't call the police. Please don't call the police. And inevitably, he went and got my car keys and put them around his neck again, and my cell phone. So I was not able to call anyone, and I wasn't able to leave in my car.
And we're now seeing some of the images, the aftermath from this violent incident. Susan Constantine, as you're listening and watching Sarah Boone testify and recall this part of their relationship, what are you noticing?
Oh, well, it's totally truthful. So everything that she's saying is in sync with her demonstrative, her movements, her gesturing, even where she's saying that I don't know what really got him teed up. Her eyes roll like she's actually trying to figure out, I don't know what it was. The other thing is that she's very descriptive, even to the sound, like the crunching of the skin, what it sounded like, and the volume of blood that was coming out. And she pleaded with him and prayed. All of those gestures are illustrators that are in sync with her words. So I found that this was very believable, and I do think that this will resonate with the jury.
Let me ask you, Dr. Bober, what's the impact? We heard a lot of testimony about alcohol use in a situation and in a relationship like this. What impact does that have, and what danger does that introduce into a volatile relationship?
Well, alcohol is literally like pouring gasoline on the fire. Alcohol is implicated in so many cases of domestic violence, traffic accidents. So it's definitely something that adds an additional layer of instability in the relationship. But again, the fact that she was a victim of abuse certainly sets the stage for this belief that maybe there was this chronic risk or chronic threat to her, and she didn't know how he was going to react. And certainly if you add alcohol into the mix, I think it raises that threat level even more.
And as we're looking at these images, I mean, these are actual images. I mean, these are not doctored. This is not Amber Heard. That's a big black eye that we're looking at there. Susan Constantine, we have about 20 seconds here. The impact on the jury when they see these images.
Is visual. Anything that you see that is visual. She says she was punched, she was beaten. You see the marks of it, and it's extreme. I think that it's really going to have a really strong imprint into their visual memory.
All right, coming up next, does Sarah's story make sense?
He was able to get in the suitcase on his own.
Yes,
Did he willingly get in the suitcase?
he was already in there.
Sarah Boone is charged with second-degree murder after her boyfriend suffocated inside of a suitcase.
He's in the suitcase still.
There are multiple domestic violence incidents.
You two hitting each other.
Sarah.
That's my name. Don't wear it up.
He's telling you, Sarah, I can't breathe.
George Torres locked inside of a suitcase, begging for help.
I thought he was okay.
The Suitcase Murder Trial. Live coverage weekday mornings, 8, 7 Central on Court TV.
Have you had the opportunity to discuss with your attorneys whether or not you would like to testify as a witness in this case?
Yes.
Do you understand that if you choose to testify, you are waiving your right to remain silent?
Yes.
Would you like to testify or not testify as a witness in this case?
Testify.
Defense, Mr. Owens, you can call your first witness.
The defense would call Sarah Boone.
Sarah Boone, 10-10-77.
Sarah Boone on the witness stand telling her story. Crucial part of her defense in her case. She's claiming self-defense. She's claiming she's a battered woman and has to explain this to the jury, has to explain what happened. Specifically, really has to explain what happened that night. Like George in the suitcase and why she begins filming him and what exactly is the dynamic that night that made her not save him from the suitcase. Let's take a listen now. Sarah Boone telling her story.
So you said that you got down there, you're looking for him, you see him settling into the suitcase.
Yes.
What did you do?
In my head, I said, oh man, we're obviously not going to be going to sleep anytime soon. And I walked over and he was trying to get himself flat, so I couldn't tell that he was in there. And
He was able to get in the suitcase on his own.
yes,
Did he willingly get in the suitcase?
he was already in there.
Okay. When you got to him, did he see you?
Yes.
All right. Tell us what happened.
I mean, I just I zipped him up. We thought it was funny, and we're joking about how he was, I guess, small enough to fit inside of the suitcase.
All right. So what happened then?
From there, it was just, we were laughing about it, and it was just strange that he was small enough to fit in there, and then I kind of moved it around a little bit with him in the suitcase still. It was still funny that he was still in the suitcase. Just, I think he and I were just kind of, couldn't believe that he could fit in the suitcase.
After you did that, what did you do?
That's when I went over and decided to videotape to just see the, I guess the gist in it for him to understand that right now I feel safe and right now I have the ability to actually speak to you in a manner that normally I would not have the ability to. We continue to, I guess, speak to one another, and his tone changed, and I knew the tone, and we ended up, I guess, arguing back and forth with one another, and it was the things that he was saying very much frightened me, and cursing at me and threatening me.
So breaking down her story here, there's really 3 stages of the night involving the suitcase. George is getting in, and it's funny. Can he fit in there? They're playing some strange version of hide and seek. And then she zips him in there, and it's funny, and they're laughing. Then she films him, and we've seen the film. We've seen the video. She taunts him, curses at him. He pleads for his life. Then the 3rd stage, not on video, is him getting angry and threatening her. That's her story, which brings me to my next question in this investigation. Does Sarah's story make sense? Does this make sense? What she's saying and how it played out in light of everything we know, in light of the way she's testifying and the evidence in this case. Still with me, human behavior expert Susan Constantine and forensic psychiatrist Dr. Daniel Bober. Okay, Susan, as she describes that night and describes the 3 stages of what is happening there,
Okay.
what are you seeing?
Okay, well, you saw 3 different stages, but did you also note that there was a change in her baseline as she was less fluent as she was talking about each one of the events? So there's this little pause and hesitation. She's thinking very strongly. She's trying to figure out where she's going to go from here to the next stage. What we're sensing is she's leaving out information. That's the reason why it's not making sense. She is intentionally leaving out information. That's why you're hearing the slight pauses, the hesitations, the apprehension, and it doesn't flow seamlessly. So I don't believe it happened the way that it did, especially when she says, oh, and it got into the suitcase, and she almost was like, oh, this is going to be a long night. So there was something else that happened before this happened. So, you know, it's interesting when you watch the behavior and you listen to the language and you dissect it, you can tell where there was leaving out information. There was something that occurred prior to that made him get into that suitcase.
Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Daniel Bober. Does this make sense? Does this make sense going from we're laughing, it's funny, to I'm filming you and I'm taunting you, he's desperate to get out, sort of in fear, and then that's the moment he turns on her and starts to threaten her. Does that make sense?
So those few seconds where it goes from becoming a joke to her taunting him is the most interesting part of the story to me. What really happened? Why did the conversation turn the way it did? Was it really fear or was it anger? And as we know, sometimes anger is a mask for fear. Why did she stay in this relationship? This happens, like I said, all the time. Women, spouses staying in abusive relationships, so-called trauma bonding. They feel isolated. They feel alone. They lack a support system. They don't feel like they can turn to anyone. They've been gaslit. And they become caught up in this cycle of abuse and reconciliation, and it forms a very pathological bond with their spouse or with their partner. And that's why they stay, because you hear people say this all the time. Well, why didn't she just leave? But that particular night, there's just something that seems to be missing from this story, where it went from a joke and a game to where she felt threatened. That, for me, is the missing piece of the puzzle.
How about Dr. Bober from George Torres' perspective? Because in the video, we can hear him. He's like, please let me out. I can't breathe. And then she describes he then starts to threaten her and is going to end her that night.
Well, he was locked in a suitcase and he probably was suffocating. So it's probably understandable that he would be enraged that he couldn't get out of a suitcase, and she was the one that basically had the power to let him out and essentially to let him live. So that's the part of the story that just doesn't fit for me.
Susan, I think you want in on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, because that's exactly what was happening, is that he's in the suitcase, he's ticked off at her. She knows that if she lets him out, he's coming after her. Because why? There's been domestic violence in the past. She knows what that rage looks like. So what does she do? Oh, I'm just going to make you suffer. I'm going to taunt you. And of course, you know, he's angry. If he gets out, wouldn't you? I mean, if you were locked inside of a suitcase, I would have zipped out of it and I would have gone right after him too. So I don't find that to be unusual that he would have gotten that angry. I find it unusual that she found such joy and delight into taunting him.
Yeah, and knowing that you're dealing with someone that's volatile, like, why would you taunt him?
No.
Knowing
Why?
that you got to let him out of the suitcase, or maybe you never intended to do that. Dr. Daniel Bober, thank you so much. Susan Constantine, awesome.
My pleasure.
Okay, a lot more to get to. I'm Vinnie Politan. We'll keep digging for answers as the investigation continues. I'm Vinnie Politan. We continue our investigation of the suitcase murder trial. It's a story many cannot believe, and it all starts with how and why a grown man was locked inside a suitcase, and ends with why his girlfriend would not help him get out. Here's the story. On February 23rd, 2020, Sarah Boone and her boyfriend George Torres were spending an evening together at Sarah's home. The couple had a bit of a tumultuous past. Both had been arrested on domestic violence charges, but they always seemed to get back together. On this night, the two were drinking. But what happened next is almost inexplicable. George got inside of a suitcase that was then zipped shut. Why and exactly how he got into the suitcase is not 100% clear, but what is clear is that at one point, George wanted to get out. He pleaded with Sarah to open the suitcase, but she refused. Instead, she turned on the video camera on her phone and started to record George as he begged for his life. Then the following morning, she eventually called 911 and said she and George were playing hide and seek and George ended up in the suitcase. Police found George dead in the suitcase. Sarah has been charged with second-degree murder, but now she claims she was the victim and is claiming battered spouse syndrome. What is the truth in this tragic story? It really is tragic and horrific the way George Torres died inside of the suitcase, knowing that the person outside could save him and wasn't saving him and did not save him. There was really an important part of Sarah Boone's testimony. This is direct examination, questioned by her own attorney. And she's talking about and answering questions about what's going on in her mind as all this is happening that night. You know, George is in the suitcase. She's outside. We know she's taunting him at one point. She's hitting him with a baseball bat at another point, or hitting his hand with the baseball bat at another point. So I want you to listen closely to this. I think this is a crucial part of trying to understand what's going on inside of Sarah Boone's mind.
Did you believe that he could breathe in there?
Yes.
Did you ever believe he could die in there?
No. At all.
Were you trying to kill him?
Never.
Did you want to kill him?
I did not.
Did you walk upstairs?
I did, yes.
Why didn't you let him out before you walked upstairs? Were you afraid?
Terrified is more of the word.
Important questions, short answers, but important. Going right to what's going on in Sarah Boone's mind that night as George Torres was dying inside of the suitcase. That brings me to my next question in this investigation. Did Sarah want George to die? In the criminal law, the mens rea, the mindset, is so important. But what is she thinking that night? Did she want him to die inside the suitcase? Let me bring in my experts going to help us through all of this. Joining us in Orlando, Florida, jury consultant and human behavior expert Susan Constantine. Also with us, private investigator with more than 2 decades of experience, Jason Jensen is with us. Thank you both. Susan, short questions, short answers, but so important. Looking at them, what did you notice about the way she answered them?
Well, first of all, she didn't say no. She said never the first time. That was not the correct answer. Another one was, I did not. She didn't answer. She answered, it was not with a contracture. She should have said, I didn't, or I wouldn't have, or I would never have done that. But the fact that the way she stated it is inconsistent with what we find as being truthful answering. So when I'm listening to her and her demeanor, you may have picked up there was a small little micro shoulder shrug on the one side when it was right after it was the never one. And what that did was cancel out what she was saying. So if you're asking me what I think her state of mind is at that time, I do believe she intended to want him to die. I think that she knew that he couldn't breathe and that there was the potential of him dying. And that's the reason why she couldn't answer it with a clear yes or no.
Jason Jensen, I want you to take a listen to Sarah Boone describing the morning after now. And this is, she goes upstairs and I guess goes to sleep, passes out, whatever happens. It's the next morning. Here's how she describes all of that.
I figured that George was downstairs either drinking or looking for jobs or may have just left. And so eventually I decided to get out of the bed and start moving to go downstairs. And then when I turned around, I noticed the suitcase and I remembered.
How did you feel when you saw the suitcase?
I don't think I've ever experienced anything like that before.
Describe it to the jury.
I guess I was aghast, and I just can't describe the feeling. It was terror to a certain degree.
I'm sorry, say that again now.
It was terror to a certain degree. I just can't describe it in words, the feeling of remembering. And then he was still in there.
So what did you do?
I immediately unzipped the suitcase and I was screaming, George, 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 and I was shaking him. And I pulled him out and I stretched him out flat. And then I began instantly trying to do CPR and then was trying to look for a pulse or a breath or just anything. And was just screaming his name over and over and over again. And come on, George, And I continued CPR, and I continued CPR, and he was gurgling. And
what color was it?
What color was he?
Yes.
He was purple.
Jason Jensen, you've spoken to thousands of witnesses through the years. You're watching, you're listening to her. What are your thoughts about her reaction that next day, and what does it tell you?
Well, the biggest problem that I have with her statements is there's a lack of compassion. This is supposed to be her boyfriend. She just now discovered him dead. He's not breathing. She's determining, he's already purple. Even recounting it here at trial, there's a lack of emotion. She's very connected from the situation as if she's just narrating a story. So that's my biggest concern. And then to compare to the evidence, the video evidence that was real time recorded, there's a lot of inconsistencies.
Susan Constantine, I think that's such a great point. I mean, she's responsible. I mean, she has to realize she's responsible. Like, she didn't let him out of the suitcase. Now he's dead. She's talking about it on the stand. And so many times we've seen witnesses, when they start telling a story, it's like it takes them back there. And if she's back there now, this is like the Ice Queen.
Right. So that's what we call a feeder memory. So that was a really intense emotion, or intense moment with intense emotions. And when she had stated that she was aghast, was a little bit odd, considering that's not really the word I would have thought of if I would have found, you know, a loved one in the suitcase overnight and had fallen asleep, and it would have been mere panic and just freaking out. I don't see that. See, I would have expected her to go, I freaked out. I was like, oh my God. And I started to panic. See, it didn't match up, and the emotions didn't match up either. So it's difficult to really buy into her story when she's talking about it in her words, but she's not feeling it or experiencing it at the same time, which is telling me she really didn't feel it from the get-go.
Now, what did she think about George? She also testified about that, her feelings for the man in the suitcase. Let's listen.
Did you love George?
To this day.
Why did you love him?
George was very passionate. George was a very real person. George was nice to me on the good days. George complimented me. George and I were two bodies with one soul, he and I would always say. I don't believe that I've ever had a connection with anyone like I have with George.
Jason Jensen, let me ask you the ultimate question that we're taking a look at right now. Did Sarah want George to die? There she's expressing her love. She said she didn't think he would die. She didn't want him to die. What do you think?
Well, you know, the jury, as they eventually will have to consider the video evidence, and she's taunting him in the video. She's, mocking him. He's pleading for his life. Hey, babe, I can't breathe. Let me out, babe. And she just walks off. That's very, shocking coming from a woman who's just describing that they're basically two souls in one and that she loves George and all this stuff. Doesn't sound like is what I would expect to understand as a juror.
All right. Our guests staying with us. Still to come, is Sarah Boone a victim or a villain?
I want you all to know that I, the majority of the time, am always afraid and always scared.
One of the most successful true crime TV shows ever.
This is crazy.
Now has a new home on America's original true crime obsession, 48 Hours on Court TV. Coming up next on Court TV.
Two big murder trials, and neither are short on drama. We'll get you ready for both the suitcase murder trial and the burn pile murder trial before each day's proceedings.
Opening statements with Julie Grant. Mornings at 8, 7 Central on Court TV.
I want you all to know that I, the majority of the time, am always afraid and always scared. If George was able to, he would drink from sunup to sundown. And me having my son and trying to work and maintain the home and just have a life, a normal life as best as I could, somehow that upset George.
Well, there was real violence in this relationship, and we've seen evidence of that violence, the pictures, the black eyes, the stabbing of the leg, the stitches, all of that is real and is part of the story of Sarah Boone and George Torres. But with that in mind, we can't put aside, because that's part of what the case is about, the story is about. But the biggest piece of evidence, the most incriminating piece of evidence, the most powerful piece of evidence is the actual video from the night of what happened. So let's take a look at it. And again, it's difficult to watch, it's difficult to listen to George Torres inside the suitcase, but this is the reality of what happened. Let's watch.
Sarah.
For everything you've done to me.
Sarah.
For everything you've done to me.
Sarah.
You.
Sarah.
You.
Sarah.
Stupid.
Sarah.
That's my name. Don't wear it up.
Sarah. I can't breathe, babe. Seriously.
Yeah, that's when you do when you choke me.
Sarah. 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 Sarah, I can't breathe, babe.
That's on you.
Sarah, I can't breathe.
It's on you.
Sarah.
Real or ransom. I want to get video for it extra. Because I got this.
Sarah.
Real or ransom.
Sarah. Sarah, I can't breathe, babe.
Oh. That's what I feel like when you chewing on me.
Sarah.
You.
Breathe, Sarah.
Yeah. You should probably shut the up.
Sarah.
And the way the video started, this is for everything you've done to me, everything you've done to me. And we've seen and we've heard the evidence of the other allegations against George Torres. But then we watch the video and we listen to the video. And that brings me to my next question. Is Sarah Boone a victim or a villain? Victim or a villain? That's basically the question that the jury has to answer as well. Still with us, human behavior expert Susan Constantine and private investigator Jason Jensen. You know, there's a lot of things to judge her by, a lot of evidence, a lot of history in this relationship. We know how it ended. Susan Constantine, how do you see this? Victim or villain?
I keep going back and forth because I see her both ways. I see her as a victim and also as a villain. I don't think it's one or the other. And this is what's going to make it really hard for that jury, because she's mentioning about this is what you've done to me, you know, from choking me, and then she's slurring, you know, I can't even understand a word she's saying. But there's evidence of the abuse. It's right there before our eyes, right? You can't deny that she was a victim. But on the other hand, she also has a very vindictive way about her, taunting him, making him suffer, getting enjoyment out of it. It seems so barbaric in the way that she was laughing. It was heinous. So I think that the jury's going to have a tough time because she's equally a victim and a villain.
You know, Jason Jensen, we've seen scripted movies and television shows where women are victims and then they finally get the strength to fight back, right? And I think that's what the defense is trying to say here. She's finally got the ability to fight back. But then the way she does it in that video, it doesn't garner the sympathy that we get in those other situations. What do you think here? Is this someone who's a victim or someone who's a villain, Sarah Boone?
I think Susan's right. Depending on how a juror views all the evidence, they're either going to sympathize with her that she's a victim and she's fighting back, or, you know, I kind of equate the situation as that moment when a villain has a chance to save the other member of a movie where he's hanging off an edge of a cliff and he just needs to hold out a hand and pull him up. In this scenario, Susan withdraws her hand and lets the guy fall.
Susan, I was talking about this story on a live stream on social media and getting comments from people. 2 comments that were the strongest comments came from women who had survived domestic violence. One woman who had taken the life of her abuser with a .22. And they were like, this is over, not guilty. She's not guilty. I know exactly what she's going through. How important is it going to be the life experience of the jurors?
I think it's going to play a huge part in it. And, you know, you're going to have 2 sides of the coin. You're going to have victims that are saying, no, she's not acting like a victim like I experienced when I was a victim, as speaking on their behalf. And then others are going to say, oh, no, I sympathize with her. I've been there. I've lived it. She truly is a victim. So, you know, women are funny. You know, it's like 50-50. You just never know. They can turn against you in a New York minute, or they can sympathize with you and cry with you and be there at your side. So it really depends on the profile of that juror.
Jason Jensen, how would you weigh the power of the video versus the power of her testimony?
I think you really have to emphasize the fact that she was under the influence, even though in that next morning interview with law enforcement, she denies that she was drunk. It's clear from the video at the moment when George is in the suitcase, she's under the influence, she's drunk, she's belligerent even. And those are common for people that's under the influence. If they can really bring it home that she was under the influence, if she was sober, she would not have left George in there, they might got a shot at this.
It is a huge part of the story, the drinking on both parts and this history of this relationship. Susan Constantine, Jason Jensen, thank you both so much for your insight tonight. You know, it's hard to understand Sarah Boone's lack of action for me and lack of understanding about what she was doing. Yeah, there was drinking and yeah, there was some anger, but there was a man literally begging for his life. Where was the compassion? Now, even if she feared for her life, wasn't there another way, another solution? I have to think that the jury may have those questions as well when it's their time to render judgment. I'm Vinnie Politan. We'll keep digging for the answers as the investigation continues.